Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage, Errant, Book 7, The Last Echo of the Lord of Bells, Chapters 18 through 22, Sky Pirates, An Inescapable Dream, Secret Roads, A Preposterous War, and Fort Maelstrom. In these chapters, we find out about something else that Candaron had in her little secret arsenal. And also, this fort is a surprise to a lot of people. And I am, for one, kind of here for it. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan for commissioning this episode. I don't see Dan in the chat at the moment, but thank you very much, Dan. Appreciate you. So these chapters have a lot of secrets revealed kind of moments, but not like personal secrets. They are tactical secrets that are being held quite close to the chest until such time as everybody needs to know them. And I am always a fan of finding out when particularly like the situation that's going on with Hugh and his friends, that these great powers are no fools about how many leaks there are. You know, they are sure that their ranks have tons of spies, that there are probably people who have figured out how to get around some of their scrying wards. So what they have done is make a very big, splashy, obvious plan that is very similar to Alustin's in order to get all of Havath looking for them in a way that's ultimately fruitless and a waste of time and energy. And that is honestly a pretty, it ties in a lot, as we have seen before with how the way to break an entire nation of people has been talked about with lots of little chips away at their infrastructure, at their shipping routes, at their supply lines. This sort of waste of time and energy is actually a really, really significant tactic. It feels on the surface like it's sort of a petty thing, or just, you know what I mean? But practically speaking, more than just keeping this fort a secret, wasting your enemy's resources is huge. So that's what's going on with Fort Maelstrom. And then there's the whole thing with Alustin, which we're gonna get into that. So let me have a little sip of my tea to prepare myself here, because chapter 18, Sky Pirates, I was a little disappointed, you guys, because there are no Sky Pirates actually. He says he has Talia say something to Hugh about how, oh, I was hoping we would run into Sky Pirates, but actually we are the Sky Pirates, so this is somehow even more awesome. But I don't really count this as pirates when they're just attacking a base that's built into a mountainside. They're not attacking another ship, they're not stealing things, they're not, so for me this doesn't actually count. This is just an attack. That's not what pirates do. They try to profit and fence shit. So I was sort of excited when I saw the title, and I was like, ooh, are we going to run into it? But no, which is honestly not that big a disappointment in the long run, because we have had a lot of pirate encounters before. So probably doing something a little different this time is for the best. And Hugh is sort of struggling with the fact that he's moping, and he knows that, but he also decides that he gets to mope a little bit, which I think is fair. And she starts to like apologize for the fact that she didn't know the danger of sending him into Kandaron's dream, but he doesn't want to hear it because there's no way she could have known. And they just wind up snuggling, and she's sort of just there for him in a way that is really, really important. When somebody is going through something like grief, just being there for them can be like more significant than doing anything in a practical sense. And not to imply that that is not also a practical thing, but you get what I'm saying. Like, a lot of people feel the need to like comfort them by making them food or buying them things or, you know, managing stuff. And that's all huge. But sometimes just like being in the room so that they do not feel like they are alone with all of this heaviness is a lot. So let's see, they're standing up and watching the Skyreach range. And this is when, the news about how Ilenia wants to talk to all of them gets brought by Sabe. And Ilenia says the biggest question is how many mages Mackerel can conceal from their seers. And Hugh has a really mixed reaction to this. In the end, he figures everybody probably mostly knows about what Mackerel can do, so I guess this isn't that big a deal. But initially, when she just like blows up his spot and tells people like what Mackerel can do, he's kind of irritated. And he, like I said, he rationalizes fairly quickly. It's not that much of a secret, but it's still enough of an unknown that he decides, when asked, that he's going to lie about the number of people that he could hide, which I think is very smart of him. I do not fault him for this one little bit. In fact, it's especially fun too that he's like giving about half the number. I think he says 20 something when he thinks probably Mackerel could get away with 40 something. And I'm sort of wondering if Alustin can protect the entire army from scrying. Is there the potential for Mackerel to be able to do the same thing? And Hugh just doesn't understand how yet. Because I don't remember if we have been told explicitly what Alustin does to bring his like anti-scrying to the level that it's at. But because I can't remember, I don't know if it's something that's applicable to Mackerel specifically, or if it's something that is specific to Alustin's affinities somehow, and that he would have to find a different means of doing it. But I'm just really, I like the fact that he tells them about half as many as is really probably true. And even so, everybody is super impressed. Like, one of the mages is like, if you ever want to sell that spell book, you know where to find me. And we get this beautiful little moment where I think it's Talia who says, like, not likely. Oh, it's Sabe. For a moment, Hugh tensed at the risk of provoking an archmage, but the man only sighed heavily and shrugged. You can't blame me for trying. Several other archmages in the room chuckled at that, and Hugh realized his response wasn't that of an archmage to an apprentice. Hugh and his friends were being treated as though they were the peers of everyone in this room, save perhaps Ilenia. And I really love how surprised he is by this, because, like, it has all happened quite quickly. And it's funny because the idea that one of them might just be like, no, I'm taking it, when they are in the mix they are currently in with this war, and, you know, these kids really who have shown up with these abilities, they are going to be relying on Hugh's scrying here. And I'm just like, yeah, Hugh, how do you not realize like how sort of instrumental you are at this point? Ms. T says, I'm not sure, but I thought Alustin had a labyrinth stone too. He does. You did not make that up. But because his works so differently and is not as powerful as the one that Hugh had, yet he's able to hide the whole army. I'm like really am trying to figure out or remember whether or not we've had it described to us just how he amplifies that so much. If it starts off as already in lesser in power than what Hughes started with. You know what I'm saying? But anyway, so what they decide to do, they found this like fortress that's in the mountainside. And Cardivan says there is this probably had been used as a means of like getting supplies over when they were, doing that siege on Skyhold. And they wound up, once they realized that they had lost that battle, just reinforcing it and making it so that this was going to be an outpost and a way to hold on to territory, because they do not give that shit up without a fight. And once they realize the positioning of this thing, this is in the side of a mountain, like I've said, where there has been some rock slides before. And granted, they're not stupid. They set it up so that it's a very well protected area so that a rock slide does not happen again. But we have some people here who specialize in stone and crystal and heat and water. And then at the end, sound. And we get this really interesting tactic that they use where they break the particles apart as like far as they can in the stone. And then this like heat and water mage brings the water into the rocks, heats it, freezes it first by pulling all of the heat out, and then heats it and melts it again, causing it to contract. And it's a really fascinating like process that is actually so, so he says in the text is like, this was actually how a lot of rock slides actually begin. And I'm thinking, I trust you on this, dude, because you are clearly a little bit obsessed with rocks. So I am going to go ahead and guess that this is from some research that you did. But it goes really, really well. And I love how this ends. So it's like, it's not like all of this starts the rock slide. It destabilizes everything so that Cardivan can come in. And it says, they took up a dramatic opera singer's pose, one foot propped on a small boulder, opened their mouth and began to sing. Hugh couldn't hear the slightest noise come out of the muscular archmage's mouth, but he could feel it. His very bones seemed to rumble in protest at the note coming from Cardivan's mouth, too low for human ears. Cardivan spread their arms, and the sensations grew even more intense, almost to the point of pain. Then, unceremoniously, the entire mountain face they'd worked on simply collapsed. The scale was far greater than Hugh had expected. The section they destabilized went first, but that collapse triggered a series of faults and weaknesses in the rock, and the landslide just kept going and going, pouring countless thousands of tons of stone and debris on the fortress below. Not that it mattered. The Dominion base was annihilated completely in the first few heartbeats. There wasn't even any alarm or warning, let alone any survivors. And that is a pretty brutal attack. This is the kind of thing where I'm just relieved in a way, even though I know ultimately this shouldn't matter to me, that it's described as having killed them instantly, because it just sounds like a pretty awful way to die. There was an episode of Bones recently where they're trying to figure out cause of death of a particular person who was found in some rubble. And they are all going into the autopsy ready to assume that this was caused by the, injuries from the collapse itself. And ultimately what they discover is that this person died of starvation because they were trapped but alive and unharmed for the most part, but there was no way out. And so they just were like forced to sit and starve to death alone. And that concept has haunted me for a while after watching that episode, that like there are potentially people out there who survive like terrible blasts and attacks and whatever, and they are fine ultimately, but they still wind up gone because they are trapped in a way that there's no possible means of getting a message out that they are there. Nobody can find them, and they don't have the strength to move whatever's in the way. And it was just, this was on my mind with this, having watched that episode somewhat recently. So, sorry everybody. Emic Shard in the chat says, "Gods, I was watching Bones way too young to be honest. My family watched it a lot during dinner when I was 7 or so." I will tell you what, that is a bad show to watch during a meal. Like, I have successfully managed to compartmentalize so it doesn't bother me anymore. But Owen was watching it with me, and we were eating, like spaghetti, drenched in red sauce with meatballs and stuff. And the episode was one where they find a body that's basically liquefied with just like parts floating. And he had to put his food down and was just like, I think I'm done with that. So we go to 19, and we are in Candaron's POV here. And this is a really interesting thing. She is, still in her construction phase within this lucid dream, and is struggling a lot with the fact that there's nothing that she can do. And she just has to sort of trust the fact that Hugh and his friends have advanced enough that they know what they're doing, that everybody is going to be on point when, push comes to shove. And this part here, if she were lucky, if she drove herself as hard as she could, she would complete the takeover of her demesne in a year. If. It was her own fault, really. The construction of a demesne was usually the longest part of a process, but Candaron had built a sufficient demesne decades ago, tucked away in her extraplanar spaces. It would, on its own, have been one of the most impressive demesnes ever built, certainly not as large as Jacenna Deep Homes, or as beautiful or containing as many affinities as the Lord of Bells, but a brilliant construction regardless. And she brings up here a World Gate Ripper. There were countless magics across the multiverse that could tear a world gate, rip open a mana well to construct a direct portal between universes without the need for a labyrinth, and even more combinations of magic that could do so even if their component magics couldn't. Candaron herself could do it without the World Gate Ripper, but it and all those other methods took time and immense resources. Years, if not decades, and enough material to beggar a kingdom. Now, I wish that we got a little bit more information about that, because we have actually not seen a lot in the way of like spells that need materials. Other than sort of alchemical stuff, which we haven't really seen a lot of that either, But I am really interested in what kind of resources you would need and how this would work, because I am always really interested in whenever an author decides that they are going to sort of include within their story about magical beings, people with power, when they include the fact that there are certain things that you can only get your hands on if you have the money. And because, a lot of like, there are a lot of stories where everything is dependent on somebody's own personal power, and whether they were lucky enough to be born with a, particular talent that is usable in a certain way, or if everybody has similar talents, but they were born with like extra or a more creative mind. But I really do appreciate there being an element of, well, as usual, the rich are going to get to do shit the rest of us can't, because it as much as I would love to read a story where that isn't a factor, and I can understand wanting to actually get away from that, there is something about putting that element in that feels very real to me, and is sort of is a just like barely veiled metaphor that I can really appreciate. And this is something that comes up a lot in the the Cradle series by Will White, is there are kids who wind up kind of throwing in with these powers that are not super ethical because they have got talent, but the only way to exploit that talent and grow it is using certain like pills and constructs and things, and you need money for them. So the people who have, historically had power are never going to lose that power because they're able to raise their children on elixirs and tablets and stuff that will multiply their power ridiculously by the time they're a teenager. And there's no way an ordinary person can ever catch up. And he brings that to his latest series as well. There's the, I can't remember it, the Last Horizon, I think, where the opening of the first book is a ritual that requires materials so expensive that if this ritual fails, they're not going to get to do it again. It's just out of like their budget completely, impossible. And I just really like when that sort of thing is brought into the story. I just, so, oh yeah, Miss T is saying in the chat, like in Cradle, exactly. Yeah, the whole thing with Cradle it's really funny because like there is so much in that I feel is a low-key argument for socialism. And I can never quite tell if that's what Will had in mind while he was writing it, or if that's just like the natural solution that I come up with because of how my mind works and where my ideals lie, and he didn't mean that. I don't know, but it feels like that. So yeah, the fact that this is mentioned here, and we have never actually seen any spell like that be performed that I can recall, I really want to know more about it. It's sort of surprising how this comment is dropped here the way it is, as if Bierce himself has not occurred to him that we haven't seen this. So the Ripper could have opened a world gate in minutes, even seconds, depending on the depth and permeability of a mana well. With it, Kandaron would become one of only a handful of entities in the known multiverse with the capability to open a world gate on a whim. She would have joined the likes of the Secondborn, the Kyrene Pathfinders, and the most ancient and powerful singers. Almost surely Galvacrin as well, but that sentimental old creature enjoyed wandering the labyrinths too much to rely on world gates. And I do like that detail, that Galvacrin probably could do the thing, but is like, well, that's not the fun of it, though. Like, that he sounds like a real, it's the journey, not the destination, which I really wish I was that type of person, but I'm so not. Just get me where I'm going, please, and thank you. So someday it would allow her freedom, but now it kept her from Hugh, kept her from her allies in battle, and kept her from stopping the breaking of the Tongue Eater. And it pretty much just ends with her hoping that Alustin is going to have a harder time going after his students than he thinks he is. And that Hugh is going to have an easier time going after Alustin, which that is a real question mark. Like, Hugh can be, we saw with I can't remember the person's name, the woman that he blew her head off with Starfire, but when pressed, and when his friends especially are in the crossfire or in the crosshairs, that's really the word I want, he will do what needs doing. And I don't doubt that he 100% wants to stop Alustin from doing what he has planned. But Amalda. Thank you, Eduardo. Yes, Amalda. But it's a different thing to like believe that, to have an idea of how it's going to shake out, and then to be actually face to face with the person that you feel you owe a lot to. And I don't know how I would handle this myself. And I can be a pretty pragmatic person. I can be very good at compartmentalizing if I really work for that. And even so, that's tough. So I almost hope it's taken out of his hands in a way that, like, he doesn't have to be the one to pull the trigger, so to speak. But also, that would be a little cheapening of it. So I don't know how I feel. So we go then to chapter 20, Secret Roads. And this is, I started this whole thing off with, we'll talk about it, and then a sip of my tea. Actually, I'm going to take another sip of that tea. Apologies, everybody listening, but a girl is flagging and needs her caffeine, and I did not get a chance to have any earlier. Oh, that's good stuff. So there's a moment at the end of chapter, what is it? Chapter 18. This I loved so much. Shimmering Cardivan says, I just wish it hadn't been a stealth mission. I prefer a bit more flair and drama when I work. I hate being this subdued. Everyone else there just stared at the Archmage, who was clad in multicolored gemstone armor, had a white silk cape flapping in the breeze behind them, a gemstone-beaded red beard that went halfway down their chest, wielded a heavily enchanted magical trident that appeared to be crafted entirely out of some kind of platinum alloy, and was posing in front of the largest landslide any of them had ever seen. This moment made me so happy. Like, I am such a drama queen personally that I love this for Cardivan. This is like, my magic would be so flashy. I could not resist it. There's a kind of mindset in the Dresden Files where Harry talks about how actually strong magic is not flashy because it is so incredibly efficient that there is no energy wasted on the appearance of it. All of that energy is going into affecting the change you are trying to affect, and that's it. And so the fact that his magic can look really, like, impressive is a bit of a joke and proof that he isn't as good at this as he could be. And I like to just sort of ignore him on that because I like things to look like something. And I am loving the fact that Cardivan is out here just, like, covered in gemstones, posing. I mean, what an entire vibe. So I went back to this moment because I didn't want to give the impression that I don't like a drama queen, because it depends, like, that can speak very much to me. But then we have Alustin, and I've already spoken about how much what's going on with Alustin aligns with a lot of what happens with Ethan in the Cradle series. We, have two protagonists who are young boys with a magic of a type that others don't really understand and undervalue a great deal. And then somebody who can, like, see a way to actually make it work swoops in and helps them achieve their potential. And that person lost an entire homeland and most of their family to the attack of another great power, and are still low-key wanting to seek revenge. They just go in very different directions with it. Ethan looked more to the future, and Alustin is still very focused on the past. Ethan's version of flashiness and drama feels very, because I trusted his motives and understood, I thought, for the most part, the sense of enjoyment that he genuinely got from it, I really couldn't help but laugh and enjoy it in a very simple surface way, because it seemed like he just liked to surprise people, and he liked to like spring little secrets on them and have moments just like that were memorable, which makes sense. But here with Alustin, I start to lose my patience with him pretty quick, because the reasoning behind the way he handles things isn't that he just enjoys the drama of it, although he has. It's a lot more about the smugness of showing off to all of these people who are actually his allies that they don't know as much as they think. And it feels, knowing that ultimately his goal is to enact a punishment upon the world. Everybody here is going to be hit by what he has planned. Any moment of smug satisfaction in little petty things like this feels somehow extra cruel, because it's so pointless, and we know exactly how pointless it is. And it just feels like you already have all these folks gathered here doing things under essentially false pretenses. They think they know what they're getting into, and you have lied to every last one of them. They're facing certain death, even though many think they're going to be able to come out on the other side of this. That's already horrible. Even if it weren't that you were handling things that way in the end, they are meant to be allies, but there's still this like competitive streak in there, you know, this real desire to like make sure people remember that they're not as good at this as he is, or that they weren't as close a confidant of Candoron's. There's just there's a sense to all of it and the ceremony behind it that is like really, really gross. So Caster Spellstorm is like, I don't understand what we're doing here, because they're in this like sort of open landing space with just a couple of small trees, but mostly it's animals and vegetation. And he's like, I'll explain when the others arrive. And let's see, this is the middle of nowhere. You're all correct. 40 leagues north of the nearest Havathi city, 60 leagues from the nearest mountains, and even more to the rainforest of the south. The closest thing to us is the demesne of Menandus Windblown, a grass lich who surrendered to Havath decades ago, 28 leagues northwest. Okay, can you just get to the fucking point, dude? And then they're like, so why did you bring us here? Does he tell them? No. All he says, he answers with another question. Have any of you ever seen a map of Menandus Windblown's demesne? The gathered great powers shook their heads or exchanged puzzled looks. Alustin smiled, then withdrew a huge map of the area from his storage tattoo by way of his satchel, then levitated and unfurled it between the great powers. Why don't you take a look? And as they're all doing this, he sends a golem and asks the people that are like nearby, can you start clearing the entrance? And it's just, again, he can't just tell them. He has to like make this big show of it. And I'm not on his side anymore. It's not endearing now. You know what I'm saying? It's just irritating. So Caster looks up and says, well, why does their demesne cut off so abruptly? Is there an issue with the groundwater? There's nothing wrong with the groundwater. No, Menandus' demesne ends there because another lich's demesne starts just past it. We are standing in their demesne right now. Don't worry, she's friendly, or at least non-violent, so long as you don't start anything. I highly recommend not starting a fight with her, by the way. She could smash any of you like a bug. And then he turns and it literally says, spread his arms dramatically. Jaisena's deep home we humbly request passage. And a while passes, and he's sort of like, oh, is this not going to work? But then an opening forms. And I really kind of wanted this to not work out. Or for Jaisena to just be like, no, sorry. Appreciate you coming by. Have a safe trip home. So again, he does this whole thing. And everybody is standing there watching this with no explanation. He didn't speak or turn back to his other great powers. Just set off walking into the tunnel. He, like, literally, how long are you gonna... What is this place? Urson Grey asked. Alustin turned back, smiled, and gestured down the long white tunnel. Welcome to the domain of the fungus lich Jaisena Deepholm, the oldest and largest lich on the continent of Ithos, possibly even on the whole planet. She extends from here down far to the rainforest to the south and east to within a few leagues of Havath City herself. Her mycelial networks extend leagues deep into the ground, and she's enveloped at least a dozen labyrinths over the centuries. We believe her domain extends all the way through some of those labyrinths to other worlds entirely. And apparently, this guy, Matin, whose family is, owns the land that they are currently in, he's like, we would have known this was here. There's no way. And Alustin's like, yeah, you don't know, because this has been a thing for a while. Kandaran was making use of these tunnels a lot during the battle with Ithos, and that was how she was able to just, apparently come out of nowhere and then duck the fuck back again. And Carnasythe says it took considerable effort for Alustin to convince me this place really existed when he told me. And Sagravax Scalestorm says, I thank you for allowing us passage. I will treat your tunnels with as much respect as my own lair. Alustin raised an eyebrow, but waited a while before speaking. Why? Why does he wait a little while before? For the sake of it, literally. Very polite of you. But we're not sure Jaisena even understands Ithonian beyond a few phrases. And Matin says, I just don't believe that this is possible. And Alustin says, seers all have fundamental limitations. Most of all, they need to have a specific destination in mind to scry, and there's no reason one would look for an underground lich here. More, the vast majority of Jaisena's mass lies leagues under the ground. She only approaches the surface in a rare few spots. I really, guys, that I have pointed out some things with the way that John Bierce uses language and tends to reuse the same words and kind of the same phrases that I find a little awkward. One that's really starting to annoy me by the end of this book is more, I have never heard anybody in life say that ever. I have heard furthermore. I have heard on top of that. I have heard additionally. I have heard that's not all. Those sorts of things. But just saying more is done by so many characters in these books. And for me, never having heard it from one person, for it to be just something that all the characters say, the way they say it, is it's gotten a little bit distracting for me. And I know that probably a lot of the stuff that I point out does not bother other people and only bothers me. But it's just because it is such an unusual way to pick up a new thought with the next sentence. It always gets my attention when he does it, and because he's done it, I think that he had Talia say it, he had Ilinia do it a couple of times, It just feels really awkward and not natural to me. So let's see. Eduardo says, I always miss the live shows when you rant about his repetitions. They always frustrate me and take me out of the story big time. I really appreciate that, Eduardo, because like I feel sometimes like I'm being really, I don't want to say pedantic's the wrong word, but I feel like I'm being kind of unreasonable sometimes, but then I stop and I'm like, if I heard it and it made me stop in my tracks like that, I can't be the only one. So I have a hard time sort of, like allowing myself to think of it as a real problem. But I think it is a problem if it takes you out of things, which it does for me also. So yeah, I wish that he had had some beta readers that were a little bit more attuned to this, or that he had read his own stuff out loud. I think just reading it aloud to himself would probably have fixed some of these problems. I get the sense that he did not do that. And a lot of the moments of repeating the same word within the same sentence or within the next sentence, that I have to think he would have caught. But yeah, this is just part of the same thing of like using the word offered instead of said, which, we haven't had in a little bit, thank goodness, but was definitely done. It almost feels like he gets into a certain mindset with a phrase that he uses for a section of writing, and then he gets sick of it himself and chooses a different one that he reuses a bunch for the next few chapters. Like all of this was written within one particular week, and then he took a break and picked it back up. And by the time he did, that like phrase repeating in his head was gone, and he moves on to something else. But yeah, the use of more, it's just, I have, like I said, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say that way. It's very stilted to me. It feels like the kind of thing that you would put into a speech, like, you know what I mean? Or like a professor might do if they're really laying it on, but it doesn't feel like the sort of thing that you would do as a regular person explaining something. I'm willing to let it go with this particular moment because Alustin is kind of doing a speech and really grandstanding, so it makes sense, but it's not the only time it's come up at all. So I can't really let it go in the bigger scheme because I know that this is just part of like the overall problem. But that more, comma, blank. And the other one is terrifyingly or absurdly powerful. He really loves those two. I guess they'd be adverbs. And I actually really liked the use of both of those in the first few books because I hadn't seen those uses for them that often. But by the time we're getting to this book, it does feel like you do need to find a different way to say this. Anyway, just have to point that out. So he says that Jysena has uniquely powerful defenses against discovery. If a fungal mage were to walk over our heads, he would detect nothing. A soil mage wouldn't perceive any gap and would just feel unbroken dirt. No seer can detect Jysena. Liches and prospective liches don't feel pain when approaching her demesne, but some pressing reason to not extend their demesne towards her or build a new one atop it. Even one of the mind blind with a shovel would find some reason not to dig anywhere Jysena approaches the surface. I haven't the slightest clue how any of it is accomplished. The fact that Kandaron still discovered Jysena and found some way to communicate with her is almost unbelievable. If someone else could replicate her feat, it would make them immensely powerful and wealthy. Sadly, she never shared those secrets with us. And I am really, really curious if that has to do with her, like, off-world connections. If this is, because he says that the way that Jysena has extended her mycelia, that some of her territory is in different worlds. So I can't help but wonder, did she find magic in those other worlds that she was able to utilize to hide herself? And if that is the case, then maybe that's how Kandaron found out about her. And let's see. But yeah, he says, don't go trying to torture that information out of the librarian's Errant, because Candoron has to be the one to introduce you to Judge Senna in order for her to open her tunnels at your request, which is obviously an impossibility now. The great powers all nodded, but Alestin would be surprised if at least one of them didn't just try to do it anyway. Probably Cassar or Matin. Cassar for the usual reasons of geopolitical advantage, and Matin because he was a greedy bastard. I also felt like with Matin, if this is on his family lands, I could see being like, this isn't something I find super exciting to have this creature I was utterly unaware of and is hugely powerful and undetectable on our property. Not liking that. But that's just me. So they descend, and they come up against this person called Thread Queen Iblint. The tall, statuesque Themysciran woman in perfectly tailored clothes nodded gravely at him. Introductions were swift. The other great powers were far more interested in the Lich than in another minor great power. It was their mistake. Iblint was more powerful than any of them, save Cassar, Spellstorm, and Karna Scythe. Like Zophor, Iblint had known from childhood she'd been born in the wrong body. But rather than seeking lichdom, like the Mangrove Mage, she had delved deeper into magical body modification using her fiber, bone, and healing affinities to give herself her rightful body. It had been a single-minded obsession by a truly brilliant mage, and she had succeeded in less than a decade. In doing so, she had developed terrifying mastery over all three affinities, which had only grown over the years. And she has done a bunch of reconstruction of her bones so that the fibers make it incredibly difficult for them to be broken or even fractured. And she despises Havath. Now, the thing is, Alestin doesn't have a problem with her. So her getting involved, of course, means that what he's doing will lead to her death. And he had been sort of like, let me just not bring her into this. But Emonson Dries knows about her and is like, hey, why don't we get her involved? And there is no believable reason why Alestin would have a problem with that. So even though he really doesn't want to kill her, he is just standing here watching this person get involved that he knows is not going to make it for totally different reasons. And it says that he was hoping she would be able to enjoy watching Havath fall before she died. And that is truly rough. It's really fascinating to read about a villain, and I'm going to call Alestin a villain here. A villain who every step of the way knows better and is telling themselves the story they need to keep doing what they're doing. I need to know that they know what they're doing is wrong. You know what I mean? For somebody like Alestin, who had previously seemed to be a decent person who was on our side. And I just really... The thought of somebody who genuinely does not really understand the difference between right and wrong is scary for its own reasons. But a person who does know better and simply talks himself out of their conscience feels like something that you just encounter in literally every day of your life. I think even the best of us do this. And that's what makes it so particularly scary, is that it's like a really close to home sort of failing. So anyway, that is the end of 21. Or the end of 20, we get into 21. And this is when we're with Valia. And she is really struggling here because she's with Icola, who is she wants to just slap and shake her, basically, regarding the involvement that they have which Ikola is still keeping secret, obviously. And Ikola is saying, we have 3 entire armies invading our territory, and we have absolutely no idea where 2 of them are. Valia shrugged. It's just a consequence of their goals. Not a lot of examples in history of armies marching purely for destruction rather than conquest. And I thought, oh, that's a really good point. Like, people are usually trying to take something for themselves, which indicates a certain type of approach, because you want to preserve so that once it's yours, you can rebuild enough that it's worth having. But if you're just coming here to fuck things up and then, like, let it be fucked, you could do a lot more intensive versions of every kind of attack and not give any fucks. So let's see. I'm trying to see the spot where I left off here. If we don't have that as an explanation, then what? We have to believe in some bizarre ahistorical force from outside our world. The idea is absurd. I love that Valia is trying to, like, bait her, and Ikola is not falling for it. I care less about explaining their strategies than I do about countering them. We're not entirely ignorant, Valia said. We know their destinations, we know when they're due to arrive, and while Alustin's army seems to have disappeared, we've managed to keep tabs on at least a few of Valynia and Indris's army. And there's an interesting, like, they have a conversation about Heliothrax, who is apparently just being really obsessive about getting some protections on herself because she had weaknesses that almost got her killed, but didn't, you know, as Ikola points out. Like, she literally had a mountain thrown on her and she's okay. So I don't really know what more she wants. Valia is like, when she asks about will she be ready for Alustin's deadline, Ikola is like, yeah, about that. What is the fucking deal with him even having this deadline? Like, I don't get this. And Valia's explanation is basically what it comes down to is he's trying to fuck with people's heads. Either he's not going to attack on the day that he said, and that's going to, like, throw things into a little bit of disarray because we were all prepared and then it didn't happen. Which, that will inconvenience us and confuse things, and potentially that will be its own accomplishment. Or he is going to attack on the day he said, which is going to imply a plan of some kind, something to make him so confident that letting us all know what day it was happening was not a problem. And I am assuming now at this point that he has chosen a particular day because of the, like, last echo spell being on that at that time, but I may be totally wrong about that. But yeah, if you are trying to be like, oh, I bet he doesn't attack today, I bet he's just saying that to distract us or whatever, and then the attack does indeed begin, that is going to make you stop and go, oh shit, I really had this wrong, and now I don't know what to expect, because obviously this dude is on a level that I was not prepared for at all, and that would kind of get under your skin, you know? So Valia then goes back to Sacred Swordsman headquarters, and we have a really interesting little section here where we get to see how soft-hearted Valia is in many ways. She is struggling with the training of a lot of raw new mages who are being recruited with the understanding that they're mostly not going to make it out, and, like, it's just, they're so young that probably a lot of them don't feel that they are mortal. So they don't worry yet, you know, they are not taking this as seriously as she is, because how can you take it seriously unless you have the experience to know? And they don't yet. There were only 15 combat-ready veterans in the Sacred Swordsman now. Another 40 recruits had only been pacted for a few weeks or months, and a dozen fresh recruits who hadn't even packed it yet. None of her recruits were children. She wasn't Candaron, turning children into soldiers. And I was kind of like, ooh, she just threw some shade. And it's interesting because, like, I don't entirely disagree with that assessment. You know, I don't know how much Candaron had expressly intended this from the start, but it does feel like she intended something. And she says they weren't allowed to go into battle until they were at least 20. Still uncomfortably young, to be sure, but the world wasn't kind enough to wait any longer. So, you know, like, waiting that long, that's quite late compared to, you know, we have an 18 year old minimum. And it's just interesting to see how reticent she is to put anybody in danger when she's on the side of the nation that seems the most bloodthirsty and uncaring of the welfare of their people in a bigger sense, you know? So there was one action Valia could take above all others, pacting the dozen unpacked warlords with enchanted weapons. So she has to go to this warehouse to find them. Despite the absolutely absurd number of enchantments stored in the warehouse, it felt mostly empty. The enchanted items needed to be kept a reasonable distance apart to eliminate the risk of a resonance cascade. And that was really interesting to me because initially when she's talking about a warehouse, what I'm picturing is like the end of that Indiana Jones movie where you see the Ark packed up and put in a box and brought into this huge area where it will never be seen by man again. And that was what I was imagining. But then when she framed it like this, my brain switched to imagining a museum where there's plenty of room for each thing on its own little plinth, and there's room for multiple people to be walking around it without getting anywhere near each other. So McShard says, I could have been drafted, forced to fight against my will at 18. One of the most morally questionable groups is hesitant to allow 20-year-old volunteers. I'm so tired. Exactly. It's so, you guys, you know what? I'm not doing it. I don't have enough time left. So, I don't have enough time to get into each and every weapon and how they work. But she has, like, she gets everything that she needs. And when she goes back to the kids that are going to be packed, and I'm calling them kids, but I mean, they are. They fight with one another over who's getting packed to what and are like eager in a way that really makes her feel nauseated because, again, it just emphasizes how much they don't really understand. And there's a mention of the Vault of Last Resort. It says Valia had no idea what the sphere was, or where the Dominion had gotten it from, the metal. Though now that she knew about universal meddlers, she had a new theory about all that. It took longer to get in than entering the warehouse had taken. Once they were aligned, they showed a small, mostly empty chamber containing only 3 weapons, a sword, a dagger, and a single tattered silk glove. And this moment, here it is. She wanted to weep at the fact that they came close to blows over who would get to pack the 3 weapons of last resort, even knowing they wouldn't survive their use, because these are so incredibly powerful that they're catastrophic to the person who's wearing them or using them, and they're fine with it. They don't, truly wild. This is why they use young people in war, though. It's not just like, oh, they're stronger, they're faster because they're younger. It's because they're stupid and don't value their own lives because they don't get it. They don't have perspective, and that's the best. If they don't understand what they're really doing, then all the better. They'll sign up a lot more quickly. Ugh, gross. So, then chapter 22, Fort Maelstrom. And there's like the main bulk of this chapter is spent on all of them learning that this place exists and the like spectacle of getting to it. And I'm trying to find the spot here where it is. Yeah, here it is. Eden Slane says, whatever the secret place is, maybe it is simply that old. If I had to place a wager, I'd have bet on the Storm Queens hiding a patch of the plains themselves. Talia and Godric both nodded, but it wasn't until the next day they were to find out that both of Eden Slane's guesses were completely off the mark. And they see this huge cyclone that is just in place. And Talia's like, that looks very noticeable. I'm not really sure, like, what, aren't they trying to keep it hidden? And he's like, oh yeah, no, somebody has definitely noticed it. The grasslands around the immense tornado were torn and scarred by battle, and the broken bodies of Havathi mages, soldiers, and dragons were scattered for leagues. Talia didn't think it had been a full army, probably just a regional militia. She didn't dwell long on the Havathi dead, though, mostly thanks to the fact that they were heading straight for the tornado. And we get this amazing moment where she can sense that Ilinia is like watching them and wanting them to be like afraid and to object over the fact that they're heading straight into the storm. And Talia, who is simply just very contrarian, can't help but like give her a beaming smile and a little wave, which irritates Ilinia a lot. And I just found that so funny. Like, I can be that kind of contrarian. Also, I really enjoyed this. I wish that people would react like this a little bit more to Alestin, to be honest. But, you know, did we just pass through a ward? Talia half shouted to Hugh. He nodded. One similarly designed to the one I used to protect the Estel. It's at least partially powered by the tornado, too. And there are all of these things that come up here. There was a ring of fire around the inner edge of the tornado's wall. And heavily fortified towers surrounded by a vast, dry moat that rose in the center of the calm space around them. The third thing was almost boring by comparison. Curled around part of the tower's base lay a colossal snake-like hydra wreathed in chains. And I'm assuming that's, what's-his-face, right? I can't remember his name. I never do. But the chains that were, you know, have that sentience and take over the hydra at the end of the siege. So Sabe is the first one to be like, what the fuck happened to secrecy? Why are we being so too much about everything? And Eden Slane is like, yeah, I have to agree. I don't understand it. Our strategy was like built around getting to people and then advancing on the city. And this makes that not possible. And Ilinia says, yeah, that was our plan, and everybody knew it. They spent the last few days desperately hunting for our concealed base. Now, even if they wanted to assemble a force big enough to take on Fort Maelstrom, they simply don't have enough time to do so. That hardly makes their local response forces harmless. Of course not. They're still a threat. But they aren't siege units. They're like, you know, mobile troops. And Talia asks, how long can you maintain this? And she says, even with Indris, Clan Castus, and more than 100 lesser wind mages helping, no more than a month. But we won't need it for even a week. And let's see, I'm trying to jump so that I make sure to use this last time. Raimel the Chained, thank you, Mcshard. The bulk of Alestin's forces are traveling shorter distances than ours. If our battleground was west, we'd have the biggest army by far, but we simply can't supply or transport enough troops for that. Alestin also has Sarnassus on his side. Havath might have eclipsed them in the past few decades, and Sika is rising as well, but there's a good reason they were the dominant nation on the continent for centuries after Ithos. They are massive. And Elenia's like, yeah, and their nations do not trust us or believe in what we are trying to fight for. And I'm sure they have been told some shit about us. Plus, we have already had to confess to the fact that we lied regarding the plague. And, it just doesn't look great for them. I love her look at Sabe about that too. Just being like, yeah, we had to confess we lied. That's your fault. I love that Talia gets a message. Your parents are here and you need to go rescue Hugh from them. And Talia just takes off. And that is the end of the chapter. So, all right. Well, kids, I hope that you are enjoying the coverage. Really, really interested to see if, everybody's got secrets up their sleeve. Are they finding out about one another's secret? You know what I'm saying? I am just interested to see the reactions to that. So that's what I'm looking forward to. All right, everybody. I will be seeing you next week. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.